Hey everyone, today we're going to be continuing on with my very belated wrap-ups. Today I'm going to be covering everything that I read in August of 2020. I read 10 books? 10 books. Yes, I read 10 books in August of 2020. And disclaimer, like in the last video, it's been almost a year. I don't necessarily remember all of these to the greatest degree. I'm mostly relying on my Goodreads reviews and just like the vague feelings that I remember about them. But if I don't provide a lot of evidence for why I felt that way, that's why. I wouldn't expect a whole lot from these brief wrap-ups. The first book that I finished in August of last year was Alanna, the First Adventure by Tamora Pierce. I listened to the audiobook of this, I think. I gave it 5 stars. It's one of my favorite books. It's one of my favorite series. It's like the first fantasy series that I ever really read and just fell in love with, like high fantasy. I fell in love with the world and the characters and Tamora Pierce's writing style. This is a middle grade / YA book series about a young girl who wants to be a knight, but in the world she lives in, only boys can become knights, so she disguises herself as a boy and goes on adventures for the next 10 years, basically. I don't have tons to say about it just because it is one of my, childhood favorites, and it's wrapped up in so much nostalgia that I can't really even look at it properly. But just as for the audiobook, not the greatest experience. It was read by a single narrator, I don't remember her name, but she did this weird thing where she alternated the characters. Like, some of them were British, some of them were American, their accents, at random, even if they were very close cousins who grew up in the same place. It didn't make sense. I didn't understand why she did that. And it was different British accents too. Some were nobility, some were commoners. Some of the commoners had a British accent, some did not. Some of the nobles had a British accent. Count Roger had a British accent. His cousin, Jonathan, who grew up in the palace with him, they grew up in the palace together, had an American accent. It really didn't make sense. And also, second note on that, it was just such a terrible accent. I don't understand why she did it. These are not comments on the book itself. The book is wonderful. I love the book. But man, she made some interesting choices with the audiobook there. Not my favorite audiobook experience, but it wasn't bad if you could get past the accents. Just one of my favorite books. Then I read Educated by Tara Westover. This was also an audiobook, I believe. No, this was not an audiobook. I read Educated by Tara Westover. This is a memoir about a girl who grew up in a very religious family, borderline cultish, I believe. I don't think it was actually a cult, but I think it was almost a cult, and her family didn't really believe in education for their daughters, so she kind of found a way for herself to get an education, and she wound up going to college, and that was the first time she'd ever heard of the Holocaust. And it's kind of about her on her journey to getting educated, kind of. Interesting book. I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. I thought it was one of those books that was just well worth the hype. It was just really interesting and really detailed and really fascinating about her life, and she really does touch you with her story. One of my favorite things in this book was how she handled memory, because her living situation growing up was very abusive, and her parents were gaslighting her even as an adult. So she does very much struggle with memory of situations, and when she can, she gets multiple accounts of the same situation, and she discusses the differences in those accounts and how she can't really account for that. She can't really explain why she remembers something one way and her brother remembers something a different way, and her parents remember it an entirely different way from both of them. And she kind of says, she admits up front that she doesn't know really what is right or not. And that was really, really interesting to me, because I love when memoirs play with memory like that, because you don't remember things 100%. She could have just gone with her own memory and played it off as real, and that would have been fine too. But I really love that she did kind of admit to not knowing the whole truth in situations, and how it was kind of very, very subjective. I don't have any real negatives on this book. I thought it was really good, but I do think in general I wish she'd gone a little bit more into depth on her political beliefs and social justice kind of beliefs, and just the way she saw the world, and not so you can judge her or anything, but because she had such a change in her worldview from her teen years growing up in a very fundamentalist Christian family, Mormon family, to going to college and kind of seeing the world and really opening her horizons there. Like, it's such a change, and I feel like she very much shied away from talking about anything that was like too political. Like, she discussed her views on race a little bit and how that changed, but I really do wish she'd gone more in depth on a more broader range of topics. I feel like that would have been interesting. But I really enjoyed this book. I don't think it's one that really lasted with me very long. Like, it was such an enjoyable read, but when I put it down, it was kind of just like, that was it. I wasn't sitting there thinking about it for a good deal of time, but I really would recommend this if you enjoy memoirs. Then I read Real Queer America by Samantha Allen. This is a nonfiction book. It's a travel memoir, kind of, about a woman who is a journalist, and she pretty much just goes around the country, goes around America to different, very like stereotypically red states who voted for Trump in the 2016 election, and she finds LGBT plus havens in them, like safe havens where people congregate, and she discusses the communities in those very Republican states who aren't necessarily considered a safe place for LGBT plus people. And she comes at it as someone who does come from the South, who does like to live in small towns, who doesn't want to live in New York just because she'd be more accepted in New York. She's a trans woman, and a lot of the book does focus on like trans issues just because like those are obviously very close to her, but it encompasses all LGBT plus issues, and it was a really great book. I gave it 4 stars, and it was one of my favorite books from last year. I kind of just picked it up at random just to like, because I needed an audiobook, I just needed something to listen to. So I picked up this one, and it was so wonderful. Like, I genuinely can't recommend this book enough if you're interested in like LGBT issues, and especially like what it's like to be LGBT plus in small towns. And she discusses like her white privilege, and she talks to a lot of different people in towns. Like, she talks to people who own like an LGBT plus club in, you know, Mississippi or whatever, that like this is the one club that is there. I mean, not in the entire state of Mississippi, but like, you know, she goes to like this one club that's like one of the only clubs that's there. It's like, that's the place that you go if you are queer. Like, that's the only place you go. So she kind of discusses how that's different from some place like San Francisco or New York, where there are so many different options. And it's just such a fascinating book. I really don't have anything negative at all to say about this one. I just thought it was wonderful. It was like one of those just barely not 5 stars because I just didn't love it that much. But it is a book that I definitely plan to reread at some point because it was just so wonderful and so upbeat and optimistic. Like, she talked about serious issues, but the bulk of the book was really just focused on people living their lives and expressing themselves and being true to themselves, and just how people in these very, you know, stereotypically conservative places are actually working towards LGBT plus rights and how they're achieving them. And it was really wonderful, and I do just highly, highly recommend this book. Then I read Wolf at the Table by Augusten Burroughs. This is one of his memoirs. He writes a fair number of memoirs. This one allegedly focused on his father, I believe. I don't really remember this book at all, so I'm just looking down at Goodreads to try to figure out what it was about. Yeah, it's about his father and his father's abuse. And betrayal after shocking betrayal ensued, and Augusten's childhood was over. I believe his father was very abusive towards his mother, and his mother left him when Augusten Burroughs was young, I think. But I don't know, it felt almost like Burroughs was writing this book because he had an abusive father, and that was something that he could write a book about, because he's written several memoirs. I haven't read any of them, so I can't judge any of them. But it just seemed like he had no interest in his father as a person. Like, this whole book was allegedly about his father, but it at the same time just kind of felt like his father didn't really have much of an impact on the book. Like, it was kind of just like, oh, this is my father. He's abusive. Maybe he's a sociopath. Maybe he would murder my mother. I don't know. And then it just kind of ended. And it was just, I found it kind of unpleasant, and I found Augusten Burroughs kind of unpleasant. And I didn't really expect much from this book because I didn't know much about him when I started it, but it was a little bit of a rough read, and I don't think I would read anything else by Augusten Burroughs. Oh, this is what I wrote in my review. It felt almost like his father was some vaguely ominous presence, constantly hovering in the shadows rather than being explored by the story. Which, yeah, that's kind of how I how I remember it feeling. Like, I didn't come away feeling like I knew anything about his father, apart from that he was kind of a bad dude. And it was just kind of a meandering and pointless book, which, I don't know, that might just be his writing style, because it was definitely a little more, like, on the artsy side, and I might have just not liked his writing style. I don't know. That's all I have to say about that book. I don't really remember it. It's been a year, so this is what happens. Then I read The Color Purple by Alice Walker, which I gave 4 stars. This was overall a pretty good reading month, I think, because I'm on, my 4th book, and this is the 3rd one I've given 4 stars. My 5th book, and I gave one of them 5 stars. Pretty good reading month that August was. The Color Purple is a historical fiction book about a black girl living in the American South. Essentially, she's sexually assaulted by her father, and then she gets married to a bad man, and it's also about her sister who ends up going to Africa at one point, and it's kind of just about her life and how she struggles and how she overcomes certain things, and it's really, really fascinating. I always feel a little bit weird, like, whenever I review, like, classic books, because it's like, everyone has either already read it or heard of it or is very familiar with it, and it's like, how do you talk about something that, everyone else is already aware of? Like, how do you be like, oh wow, this book was so great because I just read it last year, and it's like, okay, it's The Color Purple. People have been saying it was great for decades, and it's a little bit strange, but I gave it 4 stars. I really, really loved it. It was just a fascinating book. I loved Celie. Like, as a character, Celie was so fascinating and so well constructed. This book is kind of just a character study. It's told in diary entries and letters, and it has such a strong voice for Celie, but it's just all about her feelings and, like, who she is as a person and what she's thinking and feeling and doing, and kind of everyone else in the book is a little bit secondary. Like, it's really just about Celie herself, and I adored that. The letters were really fascinating. Like, I think that was a really wonderful choice in telling the story, because it was just, it cut the distance between the story and the reader, between Celie and me. Like, there was no narration. It was just Celie talking, and it was really, really well done. The reason I gave this 4 stars, not 5, towards the end of the book, it was a little bit focused on life in Africa, and I didn't love that part as much as I loved the part that was about Celie. It was towards the end of the book, so I don't want to, like, get into spoilers or anything, but I much preferred it when the focus was on Celie, and I kind of struggled with, like, the timeline a little bit. It just, like, was kind of hard to follow, because you are just basically reading Celie's diary, and it's not always dated, so it's hard to be like, she'll reference on something and it'll suddenly be like 10 years ago, and it's like, oh, I hadn't realized that we were, there yet. But it was just such a good book. Like, if this is one you haven't picked up so far, I definitely recommend that you do. Then I read Dress Your Family in Corduroy and Denim by David Sedaris. I gave this 3 stars. This is yet another one of David Sedaris' essay collections. He's a humorist. I don't remember anything specific about this one, but I gave it 3 stars, which is kind of on par for David Sedaris for me. I find him funny sometimes and annoying frequently, so his books are worthwhile enough for me to pick up, but they usually rate around 3 stars. One of my biggest issues with this was that the essays were so short in it, and I don't mind short essays in general, but it felt like for a lot of them, I was getting an overview of a story rather than the actual story itself. Like, he could have added, like, 10 pages to a lot of these essays to really flesh them out and really feel like a good in-depth story. And it felt a little bit over the top. Like, a lot of the situations were kind of ridiculous, kind of absurd, and I do feel like David Sedaris exaggerates frequently in his books. Like, they're technically nonfiction, but he's literally talked about in his essays how his husband, like, calls him out for exaggerating stories. And I don't know, it's a little bit hard for me to buy into everything he writes. That doesn't knock a lot of enjoyment off for me, but especially in this book, it just felt like it was a little bit too over the top, and I didn't love that so much. Then I read Terrier, which is the second in the Becca Cooper series by Tamora Pierce. This is yet another series in her Tortel universe, which is the same as the Alanna book that I read earlier this month. This is set centuries before Alanna, about a girl who basically becomes a police officer and she tracks down criminals. And they're kind of police procedural fantasy books, which is interesting. Haven't read a lot of those. I gave this book 3 stars. I've read, did I say Terrier? This was Bloodhound. Terrier's the first one. I love Terrier, the first book in this series. That I always give 5 stars. This one I give 3. It's about, she goes to a different city and essentially is trying to bring down the king of thieves in that city, because the king of thieves over there is a bad person. Her name is Pearl, and she is basically evil. And she's also trying to bring down a counterfeiter's ring, and that's basically it. She gets a bloodhound in this book, which is where the title comes from. I just find this book a little bit more boring than the first one. In the first one, she was going after a serial killer who preyed on children and poor people, which, like, is interesting and dramatic and fun in a way. I mean, like, dark and twisted, but, like, for a fiction book, it is kind of fun. Like, it's very exciting. In this book, she's going after counterfeiters, and it's a little bit like, this is less thrilling. This is less fun, and it's more just like, oh, let's see her trudge through these sewers for like 30 pages with her dog. It's not bad, you know, it just feels a little bit overlong and tiresome, and I always kind of wish this book was just a little shorter and a little bit more like fast-paced, and usually I'm complaining that books are too fast-paced, but this one does just feel very drawn out and a little just dull, and by the time I get to the end, I'm kind of just done. I still really enjoy it, but you know, when I'm comparing it to, you know, other books that really entertain me and hold my interest, this book kind of feels like a bit of a slog. Enough fun parts that I do enjoy reading it, but I don't know. I think this is one of Tamora Pierce's weaker series overall. Then I read The Girls by Emma Cline, which had been on my list for a very, very long time. I was very excited to read this book. This is about the Manson murders, and it's essentially about a teenage girl who kind of got mixed up in them and wasn't involved with the murders themselves, but was involved with the Manson family, and I was so excited to read this book. I had heard kind of negative things from some people, but great things from other people, and I was very disappointed. I gave this 2 stars. I just could not get into anything about this book. One of the biggest issues I had was that the stakes weren't very high. We know from the beginning that the main character is not involved in the murders. She says that straight off the bat, so it's not like that's a plot twist or anything. Like, she wasn't involved in the murders directly. She was more of like a fringe member of the Manson family. She kind of knew them, she hung out with them some, but she wasn't like involved in their crimes. And she, like, continuously reiterates that fact, just in case you forgot, just in case you thought she might be a murderer. She's not a murderer. She's an okay person. And that can be fascinating, too. These events that are narrated by, like, bystanders, almost. Like, she doesn't have to be involved to make it interesting. But that's kind of the height of the story. Like, that's the big, dramatic, climactic moment, is her not being involved in the murders. And, like, everything leading up to the murders. And the murders are the big moment. And the main character walking away is kind of a huge deal at the moment. Like, that's what the whole thing is essentially leading up to. But we already know she wasn't involved in them. There's, like, nothing else that matters towards the end of the book. There's nothing else that is a climactic moment. It's just her not being involved. And since we already knew that, it just kind of fell flat at the end. And then the other big thing I didn't like about that book was the writing style. It was so painfully overwritten. Like, Klein just had to say everything in the most dramatic, roundabout, loquacious way. Like, it was ridiculous. Like, she said things so many times in so many different ways, and she'd spend like a paragraph or 2 describing like something ridiculous that didn't matter, or like I saved one quote just because like it was so ridiculous that the whole book was like this, but this one quote, his permissive equations reduce these concepts to hollow relics, like medals from a regime no longer in power. And I get that there are probably some people out there that like that writing style. But when you describe everything like that, and I almost just want to pick up a dictionary, like, use real words. Like, people don't speak like that. And I'm not saying, like, you can't use, like, 5-syllable words or something that's not common. But use the words that feel natural. Don't make it sound fancy just for the sake of it sounding fancy. I hate when authors do that. And it was like the whole book was written like that. And there's really no need. Just like, sometimes saying things simply has so much more power. And it was very melodramatic. And I was bored and so just disinterested in this character and this story. And I don't really remember anything except like my irritation at it. I gave it 2 stars. I don't remember if I said that. Bored and not a fan of the writing style. That's what my review came down to. And yeah, I found this book really mediocre and just, I was so disappointed because of that. Like, I really wanted to love it, and I have really nothing positive to say about it. Then I listened to In the Hand of the Goddess, which is the second book in the Song of the Lion series. It's the sequel to Alanna, the First Adventure by Tamora Pierce. I gave this 4 stars. I love this book. I've read it many, many times. I do have some negative thoughts on it, but I think upon reading it this time, or listening to the audiobook, my negative thoughts were less. In this book, Alanna is a squire, essentially, and she winds up going off to war, and yeah, bad things happen throughout this book, and there's like a real big villain in this book in a way there wasn't in the first one, and I enjoy a lot of things about it, but I don't know. The romance bothers me a little in it. It kind of feels very sudden and very like, I love the end result of the romance, but I don't think it's necessarily built up well. I think it happens very suddenly. The age difference and issues of consent, like Alanna's like 15 in this book and all the men she's involved with are like 18 to 20s, which is a little bit much even for like a fantasy book, and that makes me very uncomfortable. And like, there are kisses without consent, which like, very issue. But yeah, I still really enjoy it. I think the war scenes are great. I think there's a lot of just like sass and snark in this book that's so much fun, and I just love Alanna as a character, and it's wrapped up in so much nostalgia for me that, I don't know, I'm always going to love it. And then I listened to the audiobook and like, so many random, horrible, fake British accents, which I just don't understand why. But I do really, really love this book. And if you like middle grade YA fantasy, especially like kind of older, because these books were written in the 80s, they're so good and so much fun. And then the last thing I read in August of last year was I'd Know You Anywhere by Laura Lippman, which I don't remember at all. The first line of my review is, I swear I only finished this book 5 days ago, and I can't think of a single thing to say about it. Well, it's been 11 months, and the only thing I remember about this book is that I read it, and it wasn't very good. Oh, I did like the main character's relationship with her husband. She was kidnapped and raped when she was a young girl, and that obviously has a great impact on her life now, and like, how she deals with her husband, but it's allowed to influence her marriage and the way she interacts with her husband, but it's still like a very healthy relationship, which I enjoyed. Oh, this is a thriller about a woman who's an adult who was kidnapped and raped when she was a young girl. That's basically it. Her kidnapper / rapist sends her a letter. He's in prison. And that's kind of what the book's about. Yeah. It's not really interesting. It was boring. Even the things that were poorly done and pissed me off were boring. That's my review. The one thing I do really remember, now that I'm reading this review, is that nothing happened in this book. Everything ended exactly the same way that it began. Like, there was no growth or development from anything or anyone. If the events in this book had not happened, nothing would have changed, and that just pissed me off. Like, and it wasn't making a statement on that. I think it was just kind of an accident. Like, the author just, like, forgot to make anything happen, maybe? It was just so boring, and so just, like, pointless, and I don't know. I've not read this author before. I say I probably wouldn't not read Laura Lippman again in this review, but, like, I also say in this review that this is probably the kind of book that I would pick up again in a few years and think, this sounds interesting. Might give it a go, and just completely forgotten that I've read it. Which is probably right. This book had no impact on me. I wouldn't recommend it. There are much better thrillers out there. Go read Karen Slaughter or something. I like Karen Slaughter. This book is kind of worthless, and I don't remember anything about it. Someone has a video where they just demolish this book. I forget who. Kat from BrewsandReviews. I'll link that video down below if you care about this book at all, because she had a lot more to say on it than I did. She had much stronger feelings, whereas I was just like, this is stupid and pointless and nothing. It made her angry. So I'll link that video just in case you want to hear someone who has real thoughts on a book and not just me talking about things I don't really remember. But yeah, that was it for August. I read 10 books. I enjoyed a great deal of them. And I would say August of last year, pretty good reading month. Probably one of the best I'd had in a while. And I don't think I've had any that are quite so good since in terms of both quantity and quality. So let me know down below if you've read any of these books, if you have any thoughts on them. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.